Hey everyone, it's the first Tuesday of the month, and you know what that means.
Another episode of True Crime and Chill, supernatural style.
Okay, before we get started with this episode, I have to say that this past month has been insane. Okay, so this episode actually marks our 6th episode since we started a month ago. 7th if you count our mini episode that I did on the Karen Bodine case.
Mm-hmm.
We actually have about 424 downloads and about 121 listeners in the past month alone, and they're actually projecting that to go up. So, y'all, I woke up with this idea and decided to just kind of roll with it. And I'm kind of glad that I did because we're able to get these stories out to you guys, drop mini episodes for case updates, and thanks to you, Amber, we have this totally awesome website. So this is just awesome. Like, I'm feeling pretty good about it so far.
This is not my first media project that I've done. I've had vlogs, I've had blogs, I've had podcasts, and this one is the first one where I don't feel like I'm having to really try too hard for it to be doing well. Like I'm just having fun with my best friend, and it's honestly it's taken off in a way that I hadn't expected. Our YouTube views are about average. They're about 100 less than what we're seeing on the actual podcast itself, but YouTube is only on YouTube, whereas our podcast is across multiple platforms.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, I have people like one of my good friends that I actually met in a Discord chat. Her and I were voice chatting, and I was like, "Yeah, no, I'm working on my episode for my I'm working on an episode for my podcast." And she goes, "Oh, what podcast do you do?" And I was like, "Oh, it's called True Crime Chill." She goes, "Oh my god, I already listened to that." And I'm like, "What?" She's like, "How did I not realize that that was your voice?" I'm like, "I don't know." But it's great though because it's like, I have people who like will ask me about it. Like I donate plasma twice a week, and I have people at the plasma donation place listening to it now. And I'm like, and they're always talking to me, well, what case are you gonna do next week? What case are you gonna do next week? And I'm like, we literally we have a list, but we pick and choose from that list. So
Right. And I'm part of a booze fairies group for my community.
mm-hmm.
And for those of you who don't know what a booze fairy is, like we all put up a
We
profile
are
thing
angels
about
on
who we
earth.
are and what we like, and then people just randomly drop off gifts at your door from the group. Like it's great for such, for this day and age, like right now when times are so uncertain, to be able to uplift other women in your community. So I
Yeah.
mentioned in my profile that I do a true crime podcast, and I had people go, "True crime podcast? Where can I find it?"
I mean, I
I,
hate to be morbid, but people love hearing about murder, like true crime and stuff like that. Like I hate to be morbid and I hate saying it like that, but it's true. And and
it's
that's one of the
just
reasons why
it's the
I'm
curiosity. But the thing is, and I want to go back to this. The part of the reason we even started doing the podcast is I watch true crime documentaries on like Netflix and stuff,
mhm.
and sometimes on YouTube. You were listening to true crime podcasts and things long before I was, and you recently had a tragedy happen to you that hit close to home. I in my past had one happen when I was very young, and it hit close to home,
Yeah.
and then actually recently I had another one happen that also hit incredibly close to home. And it's just interesting because I feel like part of the reason we decided to do this was because we like to humanize the bits
Yeah.
and pieces of it. We like to humanize the victims. We like to speculate, the psychology behind it. And to me, that's what I love about true crime is, hearing about like this, just trying to get into the mind of why somebody would do this. Because I think it's just so far fetched to me that somebody would want to harm another person, let alone harm them in the
Right.
ways that, we're seeing in these cases. So yeah.
Well, and all in all, we do want to send a thank you to everyone who just, suggests cases to us or
Yep.
listens and give us his advice on how we could do better, how we can change
Absolutely.
things. One thing we do want to say is if you listen to our episodes but don't have enough time to actually listen to them the day they drop, set up whatever site you listen to them on to auto download. That way you still get the episodes, and then it helps us boost our stats as well as get our names out there a little bit easier too.
Yep. And same
But I
thing,
mean,
make sure you're subscribing because that helps us know. Also on YouTube, if you're watching the videos, please like and subscribe. And then also, if you go to our website, truecrimeandchill.com, there is a place where you can recommend cases to us. So if you
yeah.
have one that you would like to hear about or you have information on that you just haven't heard anywhere, please let us know. We would love to discuss it with you.
And as always, we do thank you for our listeners for supporting us.
Yes.
But here we go with this week's
Oh, and
episode.
this one's so good.
Okay, so with this week's episode, it's a little bit different than what we normally do. Every
Mhm.
Tuesday of the month, Amber and I want to try and feature a case that has a more of a supernatural or unexplainable ending to it.
Yep.
Last time was the Elisa Lamb case.
Mhm.
This time it's actually the Dyatlov Pass case. Now, Amber, you ended up not really knowing too much about this case, but you've heard me go on many a rant about it.
Oh, no,
Um,
I knew a lot about this case, actually.
See,
Uh,
everybody I talk to though is like, "What's that?" And I'm like, and then I just like get into it. I'm like, "You guys,"
right.
and then I start going on many a rant about it.
Sure,
But
yeah.
however, you kind of started researching, and now you're falling down more of a rabbit hole with it, and I'm kind of loving it.
It's not the first time I've researched it. It's just, there's more evidence that's come out, because they reopened the case since I
Mhm.
researched it last. It's been a few years since I, got into it, and so, there's a bunch of new stuff that's come out, which is cool.
Yeah, and honestly, it it's just so unexplainable, and it's one of the reasons why it's one of my favorite stories to talk about because it is so unexplainable.
Yes,
No set theory encompasses everything as a whole.
right.
So let's do this.
Yes.
Okay, so the end of January in 1959, 9 Russian hikers decided to take an expedition in the northern, and I'm going to butcher some of these names, so if I do, I apologize. Please correct me in comments. Expedition in the northern Urals in the Soviet Union. Igor Dyatlov, the man who the pass was actually eventually named after, was a 23-year-old radio engineer at the Ural Polytechnic Institute. He was the leader of the expedition and handpicked the group he would be traveling with.
Mhm.
This group consisted of 2 women and 7 men, including himself. All of them were students at the Institute, and all were at least grade 2 for hiking experience with ski tour experience. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with that kind of terminology, like I was, it means they're all pretty experienced with hiking mountain ranges like the one they were about to attempt.
Yep.
At this time, the grade 2 was actually the highest certification you could get in the Soviet Union. So that's saying something right there that all these, like, early 20-year-olds were like grade 2 already. The whole reason they wanted to do this was to reach the mountain Gora Otterin, located about 6.2 miles from the actual incident site where everything took place. Now, all of these hikers, like I said before, were about mid 20s. Okay. In fact, the oldest person there was Alexander, who was 24.
Mhm. So basically, they were all just really young kids. And I know when I first heard about this, I actually expected them all to be a bit older.
That was my thought as well. Like, honestly, I was expecting Igor to be like, like full gray beard, like big man and everything. And then when I saw the pictures of the hikers, I was like, these are literally kids.
Yeah.
I was like, I know what I was doing at 21, 22 years old. I definitely was not hiking a mountain. Like, I was not expecting them to be that young. Okay, so now on January 24th, the group arrived in Serov, a town that was basically going to be their first of many stops to get to this mountain. That the notes in the journal said that they were met with hospitality at the station, but the police did watch them very closely in town. Like I said, this was just a very short stop. From here, they would do another train ride and a car ride and eventually start the hike.
Sounds like they needed to get there by planes, trains, and automobiles.
Exactly, except there's no planes.
Not well,
so
not so much commercially, no. Mm-mm.
Yeah, I feel like if they had a plane, they may have made it there a little bit quicker. But this is like late 50s and stuff in Russia. So unlike here, where we're a little bit more advanced, Russia was kind of
Well,
because
and
you
there's
also got to remember this was a very communist time as well.
sure, and the search team actually had access to helicopters,
Yeah.
but
So
they weren't for commercial purposes, and they were going out for a certification, so it makes sense that they would want to hike it the whole way.
yep. So the group all kept extensive journal entries. Now all these journals can be found on various websites and stuff. We'll also link them back on our page, True Crime and Chill. Um, the first of the journal entry actually starts on the night of the 23rd, when they were packing, taking stock of everything. Everybody seemed in really good spirits, and they just seemed excited to do this hike. One of the websites, dyatlov.reply.tv, which again we will link at the on our website. Actually has some pretty good visuals of the entries. The videos are all in Russian, but they do have English subtitles.
Mm-hmm.
Amber, you were the one that actually sent me that site. How did you come across it?
So there was a documentary I watched on YouTube that was made from this Rupley group, and then in
Mm-hmm.
the preview they showed that they had this website, and it's honestly such a great website because it actually has a soundscape to go with it too, so you can feel
Yes.
as involved. Like it's, I would recommend looking at it on a computer. And it's cool because it kind of goes through day by day and it shows the journal
Mm-hmm.
entries that the hikers made as well as photos that they had taken. So
Yeah, so you get to see a
it's
lot of the actual photos of them, being
mhm,
happy and smiley and stuff.
yeah. And with,
So
photos of the locals, photos of them like packing stuff up. I mean, it's
there's actually an interview with one of the indigenous women from the Mansi tribe that we will talk about later in there and
yep.
stuff.
Yeah, it's
Um,
amazing.
oh yeah, they did a really good job on it. So
Yep.
from Serov, the group took a train to Ivedale and arrived the early morning of the 25th. They ended up staying there for a few hours before they took a bus to. Now I've seen bus and I've seen truck, but either way, they took a vehicle from they took a vehicle from Ivedale to Vizhai. I think I'm pronouncing that wrong, but it's a town
Vijay.
called yes. So by now it was day 3 of the expedition. So 3 days in, they haven't even really set foot where they need to set foot on the mountain yet.
And I honestly don't know how they did it. I would be so tired after the first day. Like, so I traveled to Paris and to Egypt a couple years ago, and the flight alone was like 14 hours just to get to Charles de Gaulle in Paris.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a flight, right? And I had trouble just sitting. And that made me tired. And then there was, the
Yep.
time difference. That's a whole, I mean, that's not quite the same. But then you also look at like the SpaceX NASA launch that just happened. They had to be in that
Mm-hmm.
shuttle for 19 hours before they docked, and then they had to sit in there before they even launched for hours. Like I can't. I,
It's hard. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard. Trust me.
Traveling makes me tired.
The furthest I've ever actually traveled is to Florida from Washington by car,
Oh
and
yeah,
that took me about it was rough. It was rough.
yeah.
So day 4 arrives on the 26th of 1959, and by now it's a little over negative 17 degrees Celsius outside.
Mhm.
So for people who don't know what Celsius is, Amber, would you know what that is in Fahrenheit since you're the smart one?
The difference is about there's actually an equation. I could look it up if I need to, but the Celsius is for the metric system. So
Mhm.
everywhere in the world, basically, except the United States, uses it. And 0 is freezing, and 100 degrees is boiling. So
Yeah.
like 32 degrees for them is like pretty dang warm for us. So for us, freezing is 32 degrees, and theirs freezing is 0 degrees. So it's 17 degrees below
Negative
freezing
17 degrees.
in 100 degree scale. So negative
Mhm.
17. I mean, that's
That's cold as crap. Like I don't do cold. That's cold as crap. But I mean, even for negative 17 degrees though, the group is still in really good spirits. Now,
mhm.
Visay, from what I read, is actually a really, really small town. Not a lot of people, and it's more
Nope.
of like a pit stop for hikers to kind of fuel up on what they need before they actually start up the mountain or for when they're coming back down a pit stop, basically.
Right.
It actually used to hold a prison, but not anymore.
Oh.
The hikers actually took pictures of it when they were going through and stuff, so that was actually pretty cool.
Mhm.
So from this town, the group ended up actually taking horses to the last stop they needed to hit. Now, this last stop was literally just a house. It was literally just like a little cabin where they could, again, quickly pit stop, make sure all their gear was in order before they started walking out.
Well, and this was
By now,
actually, it was made for scientists who were coming out to do scientific experiments, and
yeah,
there were more cabins. It's just there was only one that was actually
was
like habitable.
was open and able to actually be used and stuff.
Right, because
But
it
I
had been
mean,
sitting
but
there
like
for so long empty that a lot of them had become unstable. Yeah.
decrepit. Decrepit.
Yeah.
Okay, so by now it's actually January 27th, and they were all pretty much ready to go. So on the 28th, though, Yuri. Now there was 3 guys named Yuri in this group. All of them had a separate name, but they're all in the articles known as Yuri. So the first Yuri actually ended up turning back due to health issues that had arisen during the trip.
He felt sick.
This So this would actually be something that ended up saving him from the same fate that befell his friends.
Yeah, he ended up
Now,
surviving all the way to 2013.
so he passed away in 2013, actually, and
Mhm.
for a little bit there, the police actually suspected him for a second until they were able to fully figure out where he was during this trip.
Right.
So, sometime during the trip, though, the group ended up picking up Semyon I apologize, Semyon Zolotaryov. Okay, I'm again butchering this, and I apologize. Though they were hesitant at first, they end up actually accepting him pretty quickly into this group.
Mhm.
He actually ended up being the oldest at 38 years old and seemed to know what he was doing with the mountain, which was something that put everybody a little bit more at ease because, you don't want to bring an unexperienced hiker up the mountain with you. Especially because during this time of year, this hike was
Treacherous.
treacherous.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, so he ended up asking if he could join them, and he actually ended up taking Yuri's place after he left.
Well, and it's not too uncommon for people to join a hiking group, but then again, because of the severity of this particular one, especially because they were doing it to get a certification, I feel like it may have been a little odd for them to accept
Mm-hmm.
an extra person to their group like that.
Oh yeah, and but from different reports and from all the pictures that I could see as well, um, they were all eventually pretty good friends during the hike and everything. So I mean, it kind of worked out in everybody's favor. So about day 7, they actually started the trek up the mountain. Everybody is pretty good spirits so far. Pictures are being taken. Journal notes are all uplifting and positive, and everything seems really good so far. They actually end up bringing a mandolin, so when they would stop for the night, they would, sit around the campfire, play the mandolin and everything, like just eat beer on the campfire, tell ghost stories, be merry, stuff like that.
There's a
So I
lot
mean,
of
it's
entries about their travels, and they talk about singing, like, in
mhm.
all their journal entries, and they even talk about how one of the towns they stopped in was very much still ruled by communism,
Yep.
and they got in trouble for singing.
Yeah,
So,
and
they
that was
were a
actually the very first
singing
town.
bunch.
That was actually the very first town they stopped. That was actually the very first town they stopped in. The
Mhm.
one where I said that the police were actually watching them very closely and stuff.
Yep.
So I mean, they really seemed like they were in super good spirits this entire time. Which I mean, good for them. More power to them. I would be absolutely dying with all that cold, but I mean, they were
They knew what
actually
they were getting
following the
into, though. I mean,
yeah, they knew what they were
they
getting into. So
volunteered.
more power to them. So they actually were following the local indigenous tribe, the Manzi's Trail, which was still in the woods and kind of protected from the harshness of the elements and such.
Mhm.
So they end up actually just stopping during the nights and setting up tent that Igor Dyatlov actually had made himself. It was this giant sleeper tent that had an opening for a collapsible stove. So it was actually a pretty smart design. Um, and again, we'll probably I'm gonna see if maybe we can find some pictures for it, but like all the pictures that I found have been where it's already collapsed and it's already
Oh,
like
no, there's a couple of it made with the you can see the exhaust pipe because he made it where the stove was inside so they could, like,
yeah.
boil water and warm the tent,
Hmm.
and then there's an exhaust pipe that goes out the back of it.
Yeah, so then we'll try to put those pictures on the website and stuff, or at least link them to the pictures.
Yeah.
So about day 10, they started having the trees thin out and the weather was starting to get a little bit more intense. By then, they had actually built a shelter where they had packed away everything that they did not need to take with them on the trip. So that includes the mandolin, any extra clothes, extra food storage, stuff like that. Anything that wasn't just basic necessity, because the rest of the time up the mountain really shouldn't have taken them all that long. It should have taken them maybe a day to get up there and then a day to come back.
It was only, like,
Because
6 miles, so
yeah, so again, a day to get up there and a day to come back and
Mhm.
stuff. So I mean, they really weren't expecting to stay up there for too long.
No.
Now, keep in mind this is the middle of winter in Russia, up a mountain.
Right.
So, and again, it was a super dangerous hike at this time. So, it things happen. Apparently there was some kind of storm that made it to where it was just whiteout conditions to where they were not able to see. Journal entries started getting not too concerned, but just a little bit more worried than previous, basically talking about the weather conditions and stuff that was going on like that. February 1st is actually the last journal entry that would ever be written for them. Because unfortunately, that night was when everything happened.
So, were their last entries, like, were they normal, or did they seem a little ominous?
I mean, it was pretty much a normal entry. However, it didn't really give much on what was going on. It was just talked about the weather,
Mhm.
the whiteout conditions, the snow. Um, they talked about how when they when they reached the base where they were supposed to be going and stuff,
Hmm.
it was of this mountain. The Manzi actually called this mountain Dead Mountain, which I feel like should probably give you a like they have a different word for it, which I cannot pronounce. I'm not going to butcher that word, but the rough translation of it is Dead Mountain. And
They did
honestly, there
not
should
name
be
it that though until after the Dyatlov group was up there. It
yeah,
was unnamed when they went up.
but still, that might be so. Hey, you guys are hiking up this dead mountain, but
But
like,
again, they
hey,
knew it was dangerous. Like they went into this knowing how dangerous it was going to be, and that's the whole reason
yeah,
they chose it, was so that they could get that certification by doing a dangerous hike and surviving.
exactly. So they actually ended up hiking up the base of the mountain and stuff. They ended up stopping for the night about a few hundred meters from the peak. So it says anywhere between. So it was about a 6 mile thing. So it was anywhere between 2.5 miles actually from the peak
Mhm.
that they stopped. So I mean, in retrospect, it really wasn't all that far from the peak. However, when you think about all the conditions they were having to go through,
Right.
yeah. So the trip was only supposed to take 2, maybe 3 weeks at most.
Hmm.
Dyatlov told his companions that once they made it back to Vizhai, he would send a telegram to say that they had made it safe and that they were on their way back. It was expected that he would send one on the 12th, but Dyatlov told Yuri before he left on the 28th that it might actually be a little bit longer. So when the 12th came and went, nobody was really all that worried.
No.
But then the 14th came, and
Hmm.
then the 15th, and then the 16th, and still no word from the hikers. By
Right.
February 20th, the families of the hikers actually started demanding that something be done because it had been almost a full month since the group had left the town and there was no sign of them.
And I don't blame them. Even though hikes tended to take a little longer back then, it's still, I mean, it makes sense that it would take them a while, but it should not have
Mm-hmm.
taken them this long.
They really shouldn't have. Because, especially since Yuri himself was even like, hey, it might take a little bit longer than we thought, but definitely
Right.
not this long. So on February 26th, search parties had been sent out to find the hikers, and they ended up finding the badly damaged tent.
Hmm.
The whole scene honestly just baffled the search group, with one of them saying that the tent was half torn down and covered with snow, and everyone's belongings, including shoes, were neatly left behind. There were tracks of footprints leading from the tent, however, you could tell that the hikers left with no shoes on, hence the shoes in the tent, too. The tent itself had been slashed open with a knife from the inside, looking like they left in a hurry. However, the footprints showed that they had basically walked down the mountain super calm and collected.
So the tent looked like it had been destroyed, but they basically just calmly walked out into the cold with no protective gear on.
It's starting to look like that. So eventually, the search party was able to follow the trail down till the footprints vanished and were actually covered by the snow.
Mhm.
Continuing on, the search party actually stumbled upon the burnt out fireplace and the bodies of the very first two hikers, Yuri Krivaneshko and Yuri Doroshenko, covered up in the snow, nude except for their underwear. It looked like they had actually died first and someone took their clothes.
Yep.
The cedar tree that they were under actually had signs of damage, like somebody had climbed it, either trying to escape from something or trying to get tree branches for the fire that was eventually burnt out in front of them. It actually looked like somebody had fallen from it as well.
There's also a theory that they were looking to see if they could see, sort of get a perspective of the lay of the land. That's another
Yeah,
theory
so
as
people
well.
thought that maybe they were trying to climb up to try and see if they could find the tent again in the dark.
Right.
So the next three hikers were actually found at different distances from each other and the tree.
Mhm.
They were all dressed and such, but really not by much. They were still lacking some of the basic things to keep them warm in the cold, like, shoes, socks, hats, gloves, jackets. They were basically just in, shirts and pants and stuff. So yeah.
So at this point, they've now found both the remaining Yuris,
Hmm.
Igor, Xena, and Rustum, correct?
Yes.
And then there was a remaining four.
Yes. So the remaining four, so where were the remaining four? Honestly, a question on everybody's mind. So far, everybody that they had found had died of hypothermia.
Mhm.
Reasonable way to die considering they left the tent with no protection in -17 degree weather.
Right. No shoes, very little clothes. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. So at this point, the last four hikers were actually found almost 2 months after the original hikers were found. They were covered in almost 3 meters of snow in a little alcove of sorts. Three of them had actually sustained fatal injuries. Nikolai had a fractured skull. Semyon had severe chest trauma and his eyes were missing. And Ludmila had internal bleeding from chest trauma and her eyes and tongue were missing.
Sorry, what was missing?
Yeah, that's what I said. So that's okay. No valid reason as of why. So let's go over some theories and complaints over the years, what we do best. So
All right.
the main thing that the public that drew the attention of the public was, the missing tongue. That missing tongue was actually never found. Now, a lot of people try to speculate that it was ripped out. A lot of people speculate that it was cut out, but the medical examiner never really went into detail. The autopsy reports only say that the diagram of the mouth and the tongue were missing. That's it.
So
nothing about how it went missing or why. It just says that's it.
Here's the interesting thing. So there's a lot of people who theorize that the tongue may have, she was found out of the elements, right? She was found in running water. So there's two theories with that. And one of them is that because the water, the decomposition went further, and so that's why it's missing. Another one is animals. But here's the thing that makes neither one of those make sense. When they did her autopsy, they found blood in her stomach. Well, actually, they found a red slimy liquid in her stomach, which
it could have been, which people tried to explain away by saying, oh, it could have been something she had eaten mixed with a little bit of blood, which I get, but at the same time, it was 100 milliliters?
Sure. So, well, roughly, it's
it was roughly about 100 milliliters.
Right.
So I'm like,
so that would mean, in normal terms, that would mean that her tongue would have had to have been removed while she was still able to bleed, therefore while she was still alive.
Mm-hmm. So another thing is the eyeballs were explained as gaping orbits, eyes missing in the autopsy. However, that one can kind of be explained a little bit more. Your eyes do end up decomposing first when you die, or animals, but that also doesn't explain why only 2 members out of 9 were found missing their eyeballs.
Yeah, that's
you would think if it was an animal thing. Well, you would think if it was an animal thing, like let's just humor that and say it was an animal thing, okay? Yeah. You would think that the first 2 Yuris who were out in the open and the other 3 hikers who were out in the open would have them missing more.
Right. But instead it was ones who were either buried in snow or covered rather than the ones that were out in the elements. That's weird.
Now, let's go to some of the pictures that were developed because the cameras were found, the pictures were developed. Now there is a picture on one of the cameras that were developed. Unfortunately, it was the only picture that was actually able to be developed due to the extensive damage to the camera and the film.
The camera was found in the water.
Literally just a picture of flashing lights.
Yeah. Yeah, that's reports. There were other hiking teams that were actually out, as well as locals in the area that reported
bright orange orbs in the sky that night. They were about 30 miles from the incident as well.
Yes. Yeah, and they were saying that the orbs happened to be right around the space where the Dyatlov group would have been.
Yep. Yeah. And then there's another picture, the Bigfoot picture, as I like to call it.
That one blows my freaking mind. So I'm into photography.
For people who are listening right now, explain the picture.
Okay. It is like it's like your basic Bigfoot picture. Like, I'm not even kidding you. It's all trees. And then in sort of the far back, you see this, it looks like a giant, it looks like freaking Bigfoot. I am not kidding. And like, when you look at it, he's got kind of like a tummy and stuff on him, like a bloated tummy, like not like it doesn't have the shape of any of the hikers, because the hikers are all these thin, fit young people, right? And even in their getup, it doesn't look like this picture does. Like, it seriously blows my ever-loving mind. And they've had it examined by professionals, and professionals can't determine it. And now this is coming from somebody who does photography. Like, I am legitimately a professional photographer, right? I've done international wedding photography. I've won awards for my photography. I look at this picture. It does not look like any of the people in the group at all. And the local indigenous people actually have lots of stories and reports about Bigfoot, like the Yeti. They have stories.
Snow Yeti. And they actually mentioned it in the journals too, somewhere we think the Snow Yeti is real. And I'm sitting here like, okay.
Yeah.
So another thing that is brought up constantly are the 3 articles of clothing that were found with radioactivity.
Yes.
Now, like you said, now like we had talked about, completely different from this,
Mm-hmm.
is that 2 of the workers, worked near or around radioactive material.
Yes, they did.
However, I would get that, but the radioactive material would have spread to the other, would have probably, like, the not the runoff, but like
Yeah. Right.
the essence of it would have, you would have found it on other things that they would have touched.
Right. So
But it
here's
was only on these 3 things of clothing.
So there's a couple things around this too. Like they're saying that the wicks they were using in the lanterns had radiation in them, which again, okay,
But
fine,
explain.
except that the radiation would be on everything else, right?
Yep.
Instead, these articles of clothing that were found, it was what, 2 pairs of pants and a shirt, right?
Yeah.
So they were taken off the 2 hikers that were found by the fire. Okay. It's pretty obvious from everything that the people by the fire perished first, the 2 Uris,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so then the clothes were removed by the other 4 hikers that were found in the opposite direction. And because they had extra clothes on, like they looked a little more prepared for the elements,
Yep.
still weren't wearing shoes. None of them were wearing shoes. But
Yeah.
like they found, like ripped jackets, like wrapped around feet. And like obviously, it seems like they took these clothes from the people who had already passed. So the two
Mm-hmm.
Uris were wearing the clothes that were radioactive. Now, the theory out there is that because they worked around radiation in their everyday life, those are just clothes that the radiation had not been removed from, like through washing and stuff like that. And that's why there were radiation on those clothes.
But it would still, but again, there would still be, it would still kind of transfer a little bit to
Right.
other things that they touched.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And
another
it
thing,
wasn't just like a little radiation, like it was actually like, but that also might explain why some of them, we'll get into it, but it's also possible, like, because when you get radiation, you're burning, right?
yeah,
So take the clothes off. But again, people wouldn't be found wearing them if that was the case. So it's,
yeah.
yeah.
So another theory that came up, and honestly, a lot of people had accepted this until everything had started kind of coming out a little bit more. Because, mind you, the Russian government and the KGB had actually sealed all of these records after the murder investigation was done. The only
Yep.
thing that was actually
3 years.
the only things that were actually released to the public were things that just were not adding up. But everything that, like, actual main investigative stuff was sealed away from the public. And I'm sitting here like, why? So another theory that they tried to put out there, and people tried to put out there, including an American skeptic author, Benjamin Radford, actually. He suggests that an avalanche was more plausible. An excerpt from one of his writings is: the group woke up in a panic and cut their way out of the tent, either because the avalanche had covered the entrance to their tent or because they were scared that an avalanche was imminent. Better to have a potentially repairable slit in the tent than risk being buried alive. They were poorly clothed because they had been sleeping, ran to the safety of the nearby woods where trees would help slow the oncoming snow. In the darkness of the night, they got separated into 2 or 3 groups. One group made a fire, hence the burned hands, because the 2 Uris were found with burned hands,
Mhm.
while the others tried to return to the tent to recover their clothing, since the danger had apparently passed. But it was too cold, and they all froze to death before they could locate their tent in the darkness. This is also a main theory because a lot of the bodies were found trying to look like they were trying to get back towards the tent. Like the 3 bodies that were found after the 2 Uris looked like they were trying to get back towards the tent.
Right. Mm-hmm.
At some point, some of the clothes may have been recovered or swapped from the dead, but at any rate, the group of 4 whose bodies were most severely damaged were caught in an avalanche and buried under 4 meters or 13 feet of snow, more than enough to account for the compelling force of nature that the medical examiner described. And the tongue was likely removed due to scavengers and ordinary predation. However, there are several things that dispel the avalanche theory, i.e., the fact that the location of the incident did not have any signs of an avalanche taking place. Even if it was a small one, there still would have been some kind of signs. On top of the fact
And the
that
tent would have been buried.
well, yeah, that too. And on top of the fact, there's never been an avalanche report in that area,
No,
ever.
it's not. It's actually not sloped enough. There's lots of videos and pictures about what it looked like and what it looks like,
Yeah,
and in that, it's not a big enough slope. And again, if there had been an avalanche, there would have been a significantly higher amount of snow on the tent. The
Mhm.
only snow that was on there was like, it was almost like somebody like either scooped snow on there or the snow that had come down in the, month that passed almost.
Exactly. And on top of the fact that over 100 expeditions in the region were held since the incident, and none of them have ever reported conditions that might create an avalanche.
And any of the local people will
Footprints
tell you
with
there's no
also with the
avalanches there.
footprints, huh?
Any of the local people will tell you there's never any
Yeah, and
avalanches there.
also the footprints right there dispel that theory, because right there, the footprints would have been rushing away, not walking calmly in a single file.
Right. Yeah.
So another
That's the
another
thing.
thing is there was a repeated 2015 investigation, actually. So, a review of the 1959 investigate, and this is coming from certain articles. I'm going to be linking them as well. A review of the 1959 investigation, evidence completed in 2015, 2019, so between those years, by experienced investigators from the Investigative Committee of Russian Federation. That sounds like Star Trek. On a request of the families, confirmed the avalanche with a number of important details added. However, I don't know how you're confirming the avalanche. First of all, the investigators, one of them an experienced alpinist, confirmed that the weather on the night of the tragedy was very harsh, with wind speeds up to hurricane force, 20 to 30 meters per second, a snowstorm and temperatures reaching negative 40 degrees. These factors weren't considered by the original investigation, who arrived at the scene of the accident 3 weeks later when the weather had improved and any remains of a snowslide had settled down. So they're not saying like a full-on avalanche, but they are saying that it may have been like, with the winds, it may have created kind of like a snow, like waterfall, maybe. Like, I don't know if that's the right word to explain it.
So what's interesting really about, so let's look at this, because honestly, there's 100 speculations about the bodies, but the thing that really absolutely does not add up is why the tent was cut from the inside and there were calm footsteps from the
Yeah.
tent to the trees. Now, what we
Yeah.
need to
So it kind of like
remember,
blows any kind of avalanche or snow theory out of the water. Plus,
right, or
Igor,
even a Yeti.
even
Sorry,
well,
but
even Igor and Semenov, they were both experienced hikers. They really were. They were both experienced hikers, and
they
they
all
wouldn't have
were.
set up their tent in the path of like where they
Sure.
thought an avalanche would happen.
Well, here's the thing though. Anybody who's an experienced hiker knows that you really shouldn't set up the tent outside of the elements like that. Like, really, they could
Yeah.
have walked the, 2 kilometers or whatever and set up the tent in the trees, which is kind of weird. But it was also, presumably, we're thinking it could have been a whiteout because the weather was so crazy, right?
Yeah.
They're experienced hikers, but yet when they got to the scene, the tent was haphazardly set up with things like skis. Okay. It
Mm-hmm.
wasn't actually set up to the standard of an experienced hiker, which alone
Yeah.
is kind of weird, right? So that's kind of strange. But then for them to have cut open the inside of the tent like in a hurry, leave all of their belongings behind,
And then just walk calmly down the hill.
and
Like,
walk
they
calmly
were
down the
going
hill.
sightseeing.
The biggest mystery, honest to goodness, is why do they do that? Why is the
Exactly.
tent not set up to the standard of 9 experienced hikers? 9, not 1 or 2, 9.
So here's another thing. Lev Ivanov's boss, who was the original lead investigator of this,
Yes.
Evgeny Akashev was still, he was deputy head of the investigative department of the Sverdlovsky Oblast prosecution unit. Okay, so basically he was like the head of the guy who ended up investigating this. He was still alive in 2015 and gave an interview to the former Kemerovo prosecutor Leonid Proshkin, in which Evgeny actually stated that he was arranging for another trip to the past to fully investigate these deaths, because they really didn't have a lot of time to really investigate it up there.
No.
Of the last 4 bodies, because the other ones, they had a cause of death. They died of hypothermia. It was tragic. This is what happened. But the other 4 bodies, you're just like, what happened? So he was
They
actually
say,
going to plan another. He was actually going to plan another trip up the mountain to go investigate the last 4 deaths and kind of look around and do a little more investigating, when Deputy Prosecutor General Yurikov arrived from Moscow and ordered the case shut down.
Yep.
He also stated in his interview that Klinov, head of the prosecutor's office, was actually present for the first post-mortems in the morgue and spent 3 days there.
Yep.
Something he regarded as highly unusual and the only time in his experience that the guy had actually done that.
Right.
In his experience for the prosecutor's office, he had never spent 3 days in a morgue with bodies.
Nope. Let's
So
talk about a couple of the things here, things that we didn't bring up. First of all, the Yuri who returned because he was feeling ill, right? Once they discovered the scene, right, they took him out there so that he could confirm that that was the tent.
Yeah, because
Also,
they needed him to know, like, they needed to make sure that this was the group of hikers they were looking for.
Right. I think it's also important to note that the stove was never set up that evening. It was still packed away. Okay. So the stove was never even set up. Now, granted, I imagine it was a lack of wood. So what's the point in doing the work to set up the stove if we don't even have any wood to burn? Okay. To me, that makes perfect sense. But when Yuri went out there, he found that there were items that did not belong to his group. Now, however, I learned from this podcast that the 38-year-old gentleman, I'm not going to try and go back and I'm sorry, I'm not going to remember his name, but he joined after that Yuri left. So it would make sense for that to possibly be his stuff, because the Yuri that came back isn't going to recognize the stuff of somebody who joined after he left.
Yeah. And, and that's what I mentioned before, is like he joined afterwards. So like Yuri wouldn't have known what his stuff looked like at all.
And today is the first day I heard that. It was my understanding that 10 people went out and then one person returned. That everything that I've read up until this point, that was my understanding. So hearing today that that there were 9 people, one left and then one replaced, it would make sense that Yuri would not recognize any of the items that belong to that.
And that's understandable, honestly. And that's understandable. Like So now something that's completely related. Now they ended up having the hikers' funerals. They had them all at the same time because they died at the same time. They're gonna have them at the same time,
right? And he attended 7 of them, I think.
They showed a body. They showed the bodies. Okay,
yes,
12-year-old Yuri Kuntsevich, okay, who later actually became head of the Dyatlov Foundation, attended 5 of the hikers' funerals. He recalled that their skin had a deep brown tan,
which is weird.
It is extremely weird. I get getting sunburnt, and if you tan a little bit, like, you can obviously tan while hiking and stuff.
Right.
And if they're exposed to the elements, they're gonna tan a little bit, but you don't tan after you die. So that's the thing. That's the thing. And so it was just kind of weird that people were like, wait a minute, what? Yeah. So I mean, it's just little things,
So,
and like a lot of the
here's my favorite though. Did you hear about the documents? It's okay. I was curious if you heard about the documents that they finally allowed to be released within the last 3 years.
Yes.
That show that they opened the investigation before they were reported missing. Yeah.
I didn't hear about that one. That's interesting.
There were 2 official document, they were like journal entries that take place that don't fall correctly in the timeline, but they're dated, showing that before they were reported missing, the investigation was opened.
Yep.
And that also that they were starting the search, the military was starting a search party before the actual search party was put together.
Yeah, because that's not suspicious at all.
No. And again, this just came out in the last couple of years, which is why I'm saying, like, I knew a lot about this case to begin with, but then going in, there's all these new theories. Now, one theory that does make some sense. Now, by the way, we also did not mention that one of the Yuris found by the fire had part of his knuckle in his mouth, like he bit off part of his knuckle. And they found that bit of knuckle in his mouth, right? So to me, though, that says that he was fighting to stay conscious.
Yeah.
And they theorize that the burns on the bodies actually happened post-mortem because they died by the dying fire.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh yeah. And like a lot of people for the original ones that did die of um like
Hypothermia.
hypothermia and stuff. Like obviously one of the symptoms of hypothermia that you have is basically you get delusional and you get warm and you start tearing your clothes off thinking like yeah
Right.
and stuff. It's a panic induced tearing and stuff. And so you start
Sure.
tearing your clothes off, which in turn speeds up the hypothermia and
Yes.
stuff. And so people, so it's like
But
obviously like the various stages of undress and everything, people automatically thought, well, maybe that's what caused them to like leave the tent so calmly. But then I'm like, why would it still be? It would be understandable they left out the front, but why would it be ripped?
yeah, yeah. Well, because they were, I mean, first of all, the tent was buttons, it wasn't a zipper. So it was, I could see them if they were in a hurry ripping the tent open, right? But
Mm-hmm.
the thing is, it was pretty obvious that the bodies who died first, right, had been moved post mortem. Like there were markings
Yeah.
showing that they had been moved, which shows that their clothing was removed after they died. To me,
Yeah.
that makes perfect sense. Sorry, it does. Um,
Yeah.
but one of the theories that makes the most sense, but it still doesn't match up with everything, is the one about how they had the two Swedish hikers, Richard Holmgren and Andreas Lichegren. They set out with two Russian guides, Ekaterina Imina and Artem Domogrov. I'm butchering those names so bad, and I'm so sorry. But they went on an expedition at the same time as the Dyatlov
Mm-hmm.
group in 2019. So they left at the end of January in 2019. So this is just over a year ago. And
Yeah.
the idea was to replicate the same issues that the original group had faced. And they ended up battling katabatic winds, which would sort of explain, like, so they haphazardly set up this tent, which still doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Like to me, just the tent is like the key to this whole thing, right?
Yeah.
So their theory is that the katabatic winds hit, they collapsed the tent, and they had to leave the tent, right? So they ripped open the tent because they didn't want the tent to blow away. So they ripped holes in the tent, thinking I can fix those later. And then they threw some snow on the tent to keep it in place, and then walked down to the trees where they were going to get some refuge from the wind. And because these were gale force winds, it was picking up twigs, it was picking up rocks, and it was hitting them, which would explain
Mm-hmm.
all of the abrasions and stuff that found on the bodies. By the way, all of the bodies had these really weird abrasions on them, like on their
Yep.
hands, like they were defending themselves almost.
Yep.
um, so then they got down to the trees and they built a fire and kind of decided what they were going to do next. And so three of them were going to go back to the tent to try and get supplies. And then two of them were going to stay by the fire, right? Or they
Mm-hmm.
died by the fire. And then the other four went to go build shelters. And when they were in the shelter, the snow collapsed onto them, which is what caused their internal injuries. And that's why they died. But they happened to build these shelters over running water that
Yeah.
froze and it froze and unfroze and froze and unfroze, which explains kind of like why their bodies were sort of separated and all over the place. To me,
Yeah.
that's the one that makes the most sense, except her tongue and the eyeballs. Like, and
Being
then
gone.
one
And
of
the
the
thing
hikers,
and that's the thing is like all of these by themselves pose a really, 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 really good like explanation of what happened, but none of them really encompass anything as a whole.
no, let's like you come together with one, right? And you're like, okay, this makes sense, this makes sense, this makes sense, but then this doesn't make sense and this doesn't make sense. Like the radiation on the
Yeah,
clothes and the tongue thing don't make sense. Everything else
yeah,
falls into place except for those pieces, and that doesn't make any sense. But just to go back really quick, the injuries about the four that the three that succumbed to massive injuries, they
hmm
said it was similar to being hit by a truck, which is why they said there's no way that a human could have caused these injuries. Okay.
So what's funny is they
But
actually
the
had to
other
say that.
pieces,
They had to say that actually not just because of the force of the hit, but because people were actually
right,
starting to look at the local Mansi population because they thought maybe they had
right.
stumbled upon to one of their hunting grounds and the Mansi became volatile. And what's
Because they
terrible
did
about
find,
that well, what's
they
terrible
found a
about that is the
Mansi
fact
like
that the Mansi
shelter
were
close by.
actually well, what's terrible about that is the Mansi were actually helping out in the investigation from day one. They were helping out with the
Right,
searches and stuff. So the fact that people were
right.
like, well, maybe it was them, that's why the coroner came out and said, No, there's
Sure.
no way that a human being could have done this.
Well, not only that, but even the Mansi people weren't crazy enough to go hunting in that weather.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
I mean,
There's just, and unfortunately there's just so much stuff. So much stuff with this case. I feel like it seems like there's never really going to be a for sure answer on what happened that February night. And
right.
that sucks because,
Well,
most of the families are dead. Now you just really have descendants and stuff,
mhm,
like grandkids and everything. Because, well, no, probably not even that, because you probably have like nieces and nephews. I think the only one that really had any kids was Semenov, and I don't even think he had a child. I know that he did. What's sad is he actually died on his 38th birthday.
yeah. Yeah, and there was another
So,
one that who was 5 days short of his 24th birthday. I think it was one of the
mhm.
Uris. But wasn't it Semenoff that was found with a pen or a pencil and a piece of paper in his
Yeah, like
hand?
he looked like he was about to write something down, but nothing was written down.
Right. Yeah, he died before he could start to write whatever. Like he literally was just about to write down what happened and then he died.
Yeah,
That's not
yeah.
mysterious. I mean, that alone. But to me, the key piece of this case is the tent. I mean, what could cause 9 very experienced hikers to not only not set up their tent properly, but then to leave it in such a hurry, obviously by cutting it open from the inside
It's
and
gonna be
then
perfectly
walking
fine.
away calmly without any clothes on.
Yeah. So, like I said, it seems like there's never going to be a for sure answer on what happened that February 9th in 1959. But it's a mystery that's honestly plagued history, and it will probably still plague history until it's fully solved. So, what do you think happened in the Dyatlov Pass incident?